Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all kinds of fuel for all kinds of people. Here at the Fuel Pulse Show, we talk about problems, trends, and issues with all kinds of fuel, plus all the things that use fuel both at work and at home, which means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everyone. And I am your host, Eric Bjornstad. I will be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, this is our latest episode in a podcast series for fuel professionals that we like to call Busting Microbial Myths. Now, in past episodes in that series, we talked about the myth that cleaning out or removing water will get rid of a microbial contamination, whereas it really does not. We've also talked about the myth that microbes don't grow or can't really cause problems in cold weather, when the reality is that they very much can. So there are quite a few misconceptions and myths going around the fuels industry about this whole issue of microbial contamination. What causes it? How to fix it? How to keep it from coming back? So in today's episode, we're going to tackle the next in our series of microbial myths, one that has to do with the testing of microbes. And that is the myth that when it comes to microbial testing, you can take a sample from just about anywhere in your tank and your results will be equally valid. In other words, the myth that any kind of sample will work equally well for microbial testing. So let's get to busting that one. So let's start from the position that we all have this shared knowledge that microbial contamination for stored fuels is a pretty universal problem, and it's one that's only going to get worse in the future. Sampling and testing are pretty critical for both fixing microbial problems, but also for staying on top of those problems from a preventive standpoint. You have to check your fuel regularly, and you have to know what to look for when you're doing that. Now, there are certain things from a housekeeping standpoint that do help reduce the chances of microbial contamination developing in your fuel. And one big one that everybody knows about, or most everybody knows about, or they should know about it anyway, is the importance of keeping free water buildup under control. But because today's fuels are so much less resistant to microbes because of things like their lower aromatic content, they're so much less resistant than fuels of the past. Sometimes even the most careful, diligent housekeeping practices won't completely keep microbes away. Now, that being said, if you are one of the ones that really tries to pay attention to the details of this thing, there is a little bit of a danger in becoming overconfident in how you're taking care of your fuel. It's the danger where you become convinced that something like microbial contamination can't happen to you because you watch over your fuel, you pay attention to it, you take care of it. But it can happen even to the best of us that have to take care of fuel. That's why it's important to do simple things like check your fuel visually to make sure that you don't see any substantial changes in its condition from month to month, right? It's that kind of thing. The checking your fuel visually is really the easiest thing that you can do that has the most diagnostic value. It's the best combination of those two important things. Still, visual checks, as important as they are, won't get you in themselves. They will not get you enough information for you to really know if you have a problem developing. Visual checks are really just the first step in all of this. Testing is the essential thing to staying on top of any developing microbe problem. And by testing, we mean the right kind of testing, like in-field microbe tests like ATP bifiltration, as opposed to, shall we say, more inferior tests like culture tests. We'll talk a little bit more about the comparison between those two later on. But it's really important to understand that when it comes to testing, yes, testing is important, but, and this is a concept that we're going to repeat periodically over the course of today's podcast episode. This idea that testing is only as good as the sample that's being tested. Testing is only as good as the sample being tested. So let's explain what we mean by that, and let's use a little bit of a hypothetical. So conceptually, when you do testing on fuel samples, you're doing a test on a sample that's supposed to represent the rest of your fuel, the larger amount of fuel that it came out of. So you have a 10,000 gallon tank, you pull a 16-ounce sample, and you do a test on that sample. You're assuming that the results that you get for that 16-ounce sample are applicable to that larger amount of fuel, the rest of those 10,000 gallons. You're assuming that that 16-ounce sample is representative of the rest of the fuel. So whatever results you get from that test, you're going to assume that whatever those results tell you, you're going to assume that those conclusions are true not only of the sample itself, but of the rest of the fuel as a whole. Technically, though, those results, those test results, they do only apply, they do only tell you something direct about whatever little sample you tested. So let's say you have that 10,000 gallon tank, right? You pull the 16-ounce sample from that. You can see how a 16-ounce sample is a really, really small portion of your overall fuel volume. And yet whatever the test says about that sample, you're going to assume that that same thing is true of the rest of that 10,000 gallons of fuel in that tank. Now, because all of this is true, because we recognize the tendencies to do that, the object is, when we talk about sampling that's going to be used in testing, the object is to pull samples that are of high diagnostic value. And what we mean there is they don't differ greatly from what the rest of your fuel is like. They have to be like that so that whatever test results you do get, the conclusions can be applied with confidence to the rest of your fuel. Your test results are only as good from a diagnostic point of view as your sample. Now, a bad sample that's nothing like the real condition of the rest of your fuel isn't going to yield test results that you can meaningfully apply to make conclusions and decisions about the rest of your fuel supply. And all of this is especially true when it comes to testing for microbes. So, as an example, you take a sample from a tank, right? You test it for microbes, microbial content. And whatever you find in that test, whatever the test results happen to be, you're going to assume that those conclusions are true of the rest of the fuel in your system. Whether your test shows 0 microbes, thumbs up, or severe microbial contamination, thumbs down. So you want the microbial content of that sample to be similar to the microbial content in the rest of the fuel. And that means it does matter where you take a sample from that you intend to use for microbial testing. So to understand that better, we start by having to acknowledge that in a typical storage tank system, when you have microbial contamination in there, it's not spread out evenly and uniformly in the entire tank. Microbial contamination tends to be found concentrated in specific places, like down near the bottom of the tank where the water phase is, or on solid surfaces behind biomass formations, those kind of places. And then the converse is that there are places in a typical fuel storage system where microbes are rarely found, like the top part of the fuel in a tank, or even the middle part of the fuel in a vertical storage tank. You rarely find microbes in those places. And so that brings us back again to that myth about how sampling doesn't matter when it comes to microbial testing. It should be apparent to us that where you sample from very much does matter. So, if we acknowledge all that's true, what do we take away from all of that? Well, if we recognize the idea that not all samples have equal value for telling us what we need to know about our microbial situation. We necessarily then have to ask, what does all that tell me about how I should be doing this, how I should be testing, sampling, staying on top of microbial contamination in my tank? What does this tell me about all that? Well, um, the best practices, right? The best practices for dealing with with microbial issues are: first, you have to pay attention to your fuel's condition for any changes that might happen, any changes that might signal something's going on. Now that's simple and easy to do, but it's also just the very general first step in all this. Now, ideally, you want to test your fuel for microbes at some sort of interval. You want to set up a testing plan protocol or a schedule. Now, the question is, how often do you need to test? You do need to test at least once a year at a minimum. Really, 2 times a year is probably better and more useful. Some companies that have really mission critical fuel, like hospitals, they'll do tests quarterly, and that's fine too. But you probably don't need to do it any more often than that. So, 2 to 4 times a year will probably give you everything you need to know from a diagnostic standpoint. And what we mean by that, one of the reasons why you do want to test uh, you know, more than 1 time a year, but not necessarily as often as, every month. One of the reasons you want to do that is you want to build up a history of how microbial levels change in your tank. Because at some point, when you have enough data, you will then be able to develop what we call control intervals, where you'll be able to tell how long a period of time typically elapses before the microbial levels in your tank increase to the level that you need to do something about that. That's one of the values of setting up a microbial testing plan schedule. Okay, so 2 to 4 times per year is good. So that leads us to then, okay, we know how often, but how should we sample? And that's a question that's important to have the right answer to, because, especially when we spent the last 10 minutes talking about how important it is about where you take the sample from, how that really matters. So on the question of where to sample, you have choices, you have options about where in the tank to pull your sample from. Do you pull it from the top? Do you pull it from the middle? Do you pull it from the dead bottom? Is it best to do it somewhere in between? Remember, you're trying to get a sample that has the same kind of microbial content in it that's in your broader tank. You're trying to get a representative sample in that respect. Now, note that that doesn't mean that we're trying to mirror an average of the microbial content. Now, if that's a little bit confusing to you, think of it this way. Let's say, remember that we said microbes tend to be concentrated in certain areas. Well, let's say you have a tank that's a 100,000 gallon tank. It's a big one. So let's say you have microbial contamination concentrated in that tank in the typical places where you would expect to find those things. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have 1 million microbes in there. You probably have a lot more than that, but let's just use round numbers for this hypothetical. So you have 1 million microbes in a 100,000 gallon tank. Well, if you do it from a fuel standpoint, that's an average of 10 microbes per gallon. So does that mean that if you want a representative sample, does that mean that a representative sample you pull should have 10 microbes in it? Well, no, that's not really the way this works. You want the sample to reflect the fact that you have 1 million microbes concentrated in the areas where they normally are found. That's different from saying you have 1 million microbes averaged over 100,000 gallons of fuel. So the best way to ensure that you get a sample like this is by pulling the sample from close to the area where the microbes are. So pulling a sample from the very top of that tank, when all the microbes are concentrated down at the bottom of the tank, doing a sample from the top isn't going to pull any of those microbes in. It's not going to have good diagnostic value, since microbes aren't found very often in the top part of the tank. So pulling a sample from the top, even pulling a sample from the middle, isn't likely to show you anything useful for this. So ideally, for microbial testing, you want a sample pulled from close to where the fuel water interface is. Now, most tanks will have an inch or two, maybe three, of water on the bottom. And we know that microbes tend to concentrate themselves at that interface between the water phase on the bottom and the fuel phase on top. So if you know how much water you've got, maybe you can determine this by taking water paste, sticking the tank, and seeing how many inches that color changes. If you did that, you would know how many inches your water phase is. And then you'd be able to lower your bacon bomb fuel sampler down to around where that is and take the sample from there. And if you do that, you're going to get a sample that has pretty good diagnostic value. Now, if you don't know how many inches of water phase you have, well, then generally speaking, pulling a sample that's from between 3 and 6 inches from the bottom, probably closer to 3, is going to give you what you need in this respect, which is a sample with enough diagnostic value that you can meaningfully apply its results to the rest of your fuel and then make good decisions about what to do or not to do. The results might not indicate that you actually have a problem. And if that's the case, that's usually the best news of all. So maybe it'll be like that. Point is, you'll have an accurate result for which you can make the right decision on. So it does matter where you pull the sample from, because taking it from places in the tank where the microbes aren't is not going to tell you what that is. It's all, if you do that, if you take it from the wrong place, then all your sample is going to do is simply tell you you have no microbes, except you do have microbes, just not in the area where you pulled the sample from. Remember, a test is only as good as the sample, right? Now, some other things that you might need to take into account. For one, what you use to take the sample. Now, when we talk about taking samples from the top or the middle or the bottom, well, how exactly do we do that? Well, the simple answer is that to take a sample, you want to use what's known in the industry as a fuel sampler. Now, more colloquially, you will find them called bacon bomb fuel samplers. And a bacon bomb is a metal cylinder tube that you can lower it. It has usually nylon rope attached to it that you can use to lower it down from the top of the tank down through the depths of the fuel until you reach the desired vertical depth that you need to sample from. So you're at the right depth and the right location. You can open the sampler up using the line. The sampler opens up. Whatever's around the sample then rushes into the sample. It closes up. Now you've got a fuel sample from that particular area. You pull it up, you decant that fuel sample. Now you've got a sample from the exact place that you need it from. So using a bacon bomb fuel sample is pretty much the industry standard on what to use for fuel sampling. And if you manage fuel, you absolutely should have a bacon bomb fuel sampler. You can get them in any number of places on the internet. Just keep in mind, though, that even though they're available in lots of different places, some kinds or some models, if you will, are better than others. They're not all equally good. So if you're in the market for a bacon bomb and you're looking at them, a couple of things that you want to look for. First one, very important, you want them to be made completely from non-sparking metal materials. That's really important from a safety standpoint. Some bacon bombs are made from like non-sparking brass on the outside, but the inner components might be made from something that sparks. And you don't want that. You want them to be made 100% from non-sparking metal materials for a safety, because it's a big safety issue. The other thing that separates some of the better fuel samplers from the not so good ones are that some of them will actually come with attachments that range in length from 3 inches, 6 inches, maybe even 12 inches. And they're designed to screw into the bottom of the fuel sampler because the fuel sampler is going to be upright. And so if you need a sample that's 3 inches from the bottom, right? You put the 3 inch attachment, screw it into the bottom, and then when you lower it down, when it hits the bottom and it sits on that bottom, it's not sitting on the dead bottom, which is where you don't want it to be. No, because it's using that extension attachment, if you want to call it that, it's actually at the right height, the 3 inch height that you need it to be at. And then you can have confidence that you're pulling the sample from 3 inches, which is what you intended to do in the first place. So, first recommendation, get a bacon bomb fuel sampler to pull your samples. Now, after you pull your samples and you have them in your sample containers, you want to get those samples on ice and then test them as soon as possible. Now, this is important because whatever microbial population that you ended up with in that sample, whatever microbial population, the moment you pull it out of that tank, that population is going to start changing. Remember, and again, think of it this way. You have pulled these microbes out of their normal environment and you have put them into a completely new one that's drastically different from what they're used to. If you pull the sample from 6 inches from the bottom of the tank, what was it like in there? Well, first of all, it was dark, so there's no light in there. Second of all, you pulled it from way down at the bottom of the field, so there's no oxygen. There's no free oxygen down there. And also the temperature was probably different. It was probably a fairly constant temperature. Now, you took all those microbes in your sampler, you took them completely out of that, you changed their temperature dramatically, you exposed them to light, and very importantly, you exposed them to oxygen. Now, some microbial species, because typically there's going to be thousands of different microbial species in that little fuel sample. Some of those species might like those changes, but many of them will not. And those that do not, they're going to start to die. So putting them on ice as soon as possible helps to slow that process of change, if you will, helps to slow that down. And also testing them as soon as possible so that you can define what their numbers are before those numbers change dramatically. So doing this helps to mitigate the possibility of false positives or false negative results. Let's talk a little bit about what we mean by that. A false positive, whether it's this kind of test or another one, a false positive is basically a test result that tells you that something is true when it is not. Now, in this context, a false positive microbial test would be when you test your sample and the test result indicates you have microbes, but you actually didn't have microbes either in your sample or in your overall fuel supply. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this false negative. A false negative microbial result would be when you test your sample and it shows that you don't have any microbes or you've got a really low number of microbes. But in reality, your microbial content of your sample or in your tank, maybe it was much, much higher than that. But they didn't show up in your test. So false positives and false negatives are both of those results are problematic because either one might lead you to make a decision that's not the right one for you, not the right one for your situation. A false negative result tells you you don't have a micro problem. So what happens? You don't have a micro problem. You don't do anything, right? While the microbes that you do actually have there and they're growing and multiplying, causing corrosion, producing more biomass, that kind of thing. But your test, you didn't realize it because the test said they weren't there. That's a problem with a false negative result. A false positive might lead you to say, hey, I've got a severe microbial contamination. I need to do something. So what do? Well, hopefully, if you're following best practice recommendations, you're going to pay to treat it with biocide. You might pay to have some fuel polishing done. And in reality, you didn't need to spend what could have been a substantial amount of money to do that because you really didn't have a severe contamination. The test result was wrong. It was a false positive. So you just wasted money and wasted time. And most of us don't have an excess of either of those, right? So all of this relates to this phenomenon where You're trying, in order to reduce the chances of having false negatives or false positive results, you're trying to do things that preserve your sample's microbial population up to the point where you can then essentially lock them in by testing them and documenting how many are in there, right? So, proper handling of your samples is important. Not being careful in that respect can end up undoing all the work that you put in up to this point. Now, speaking of that, not only is how you handle the sample and how you sample, not only are those important, but how you test them also matters, because a bad test method can also undo all the work that you've done up to this point. Now, as far as tests goes, there are some different options for in-field tests that allow you to do the microbial testing yourself. You don't have to worry about taking a sample, packaging it up, and sending it off to a lab to get results, Lord knows when. There are some in-field test options that allow you to do the testing yourself. Now, the most common type that you will find are what's called the culture tests. There's a bunch of different kinds of those, but they all work in similar ways, which is you inoculate some growth medium with some of your sample that's should have microbes in it, right? And the theory is that the microbes will feed on that growth medium and they will multiply, they'll regrow themselves. And this will happen to a point that X number of days of incubation down the line, you can visually detect them and get an idea of how many how big your microbial contamination level is. So culture tests are really the oldest kind of test that's out there. Bottom line, though, is that we generally don't recommend using culture tests, and this for a variety of reasons. They have a lot of problems. For one, if you use, let's say you use a dip slide culture test, right? And you have these colonies, you have this visual microbial growth that's growing on it, which you regrew over the incubation period. The problem is that what you see on there, you have no way of knowing what part of that actually came from your sample and which of it was a contamination that came in from the outside, because we have microbes all around us, right? You don't know for sure how much of that actually came from your sample. You also don't know how long you have to incubate that culture test in order to get the right amount of growth so that you can get an accurate interpretation of your results, because some kinds of microbes grow faster and some kinds of microbes grow slower than others. But you don't know which kinds of those you actually have in your sample. And then over and above all this, you've also got the problem of having to interpret the results visually. Now, this is what we mean by that. This idea of problematic interpretation of results. This matters because in order for a culture test to work, right, enough of those microbes that you started out with, they have to regrow and multiply enough times for them to form colonies large enough for you to be able to see them, right? If the microbes are in your sample and let's say they make it onto your dip slide, but let's say that they don't grow fast enough over the incubation period to form a colony big enough to be detected by your naked eye. Well, in that situation, you're not going to see them. And therefore, they aren't going to be registered in the test result. That is a classic false negative result. The test didn't show that those microbes were there, even though they actually were. As far as you're concerned, they never existed because you didn't see them. So you didn't know they were there. Now, as far as you're concerned, they never existed. That might be an existential crisis for those microbes and how they think of themselves. But it's a more practical problem for you, because when that happens, it makes it more likely for you to make the wrong decision in response to those test results. So, culture tests, not recommended. The best microbial testing method, if we were advising people, we would argue that the best microbial test method to use is what's called ATP testing. Specifically, the kind that's known as ATP by filtration test method. And this is done by the test detecting the amount of ATP that's present in a prepared sample. Now, if you remember from high school biology or college biology, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is a molecule that's present in all living cells. All living cells have ATP because they have to use it for energy transport. Without ATP, they can't live. So ATP is present in all living cells. That means microbes, except for viruses, all microbes have ATP. And that means there's a direct, useful correlation between the amount of ATP in a sample and the size of microbial contamination in that sample. Now, ATP testing, when you talk about the problems with culture tests and then you look at ATP testing has some pretty big advantages over the culture test. It's much more precise than culture testing. It has a lot fewer instances of false positives and false negatives. And very importantly, for a number of different kinds of testing situations, very importantly, it can be done quickly, 5-10 minutes max, which means you can get a result that allows you to essentially make real-time decisions about what to do once you've got your test results. So those things are why we think ATP testing is the best kind of microbial testing that you can do for your stored fuel. And as we were saying before, if you use the wrong kind of test method, that can undo all of the work that you put in up to that point. It's important not just to sample from the right place, to handle your sample correctly. It's also important to choose a good test methodology to get results that you can interpret to make the right decision for you. And so, my friends, that is another microbial myth busted. The myth that where you take your sample from doesn't matter when it comes to microbial testing. So, just to summarize what we talked about on today's episode, it's a microbial myth that if you're trying to judge whether you have a microbe problem, it doesn't matter where you took the sample from. All samples are created equal. Yet, it really does matter, because the aim of sampling is to be able to have a sample to test that's actually representative of your fuel. Microbial contamination is never evenly distributed throughout a fuel tank. It's always concentrated in certain areas of that tank. And so, in order to have a sample with the most diagnostic value, you need to pull that sample from as close as possible to the areas of the tank where the microbes are most likely to be concentrated, which means 3-4 inches off the bottom of the tank, not the top of the tank, not the middle of the tank. You want to use a bacon bomb fuel sample to get your sample. You want to keep those samples on ice and test them as soon as possible so that your microbial population changes as little as possible. And if possible, we were just saying, don't use inaccurate culture tests for your test method. Instead, try to have them tested with the ATP by filtration test method, which we found is the most accurate and the quickest method to use. And so that, my friends, wraps up this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. You can find links in the show notes to the things that we talked about today. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Also, please recommend us to your friends as well. And if you haven't already, feel free to leave us a good review at whatever podcast platform you use, whether it's iTunes, Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, any of those. We would greatly appreciate it. And so that's going to be it for today. I am Eric Bjornstad, your host of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, and I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.